Welcome back, everyone, to our ongoing series on Christ and nerd culture. I am again your willing host, Dr. Rob Sullivan, and I'm joined again by the esteemed Paul Carby, and we are uh, walking you through some of the cultural artifacts of the day in the nerd culture and how it informs our understanding of scripture and theology and the connections that we can make through that. And again, just a quick note, we're going to start kind of with our background. Again, I teach political science, and I'm a dean of a college at Dallas Baptist University. Go Patriots! And have taught other courses like constitutional law and written some books that I'll talk about later. But now I want to defer to Paul, and he can tell us all about himself again for those who maybe haven't heard about his background. Go ahead, Paul.
Hey, I'm a PhD student getting my degree in medieval Christian philosophy, specializing in Boethius and focusing on God and time. And I'm also a pastor to students at a church in St. Louis, Missouri.
So Paul covers the whole spectrum, don't you?
Yeah,
so the faith,
definitely.
the philosophy, and that's why it's great to be partnering with him on this series, because he understands the depth of scripture and the depth of human nature to a certain extent, or at least he's a student of that. And he's always constantly pursuing that. And that fascinates me, just trying to understand people and also understand as best we can through our finite mind the expanse of God and eternity. And so it's really hard to do that, but some of these shows we watch kind of have a little something to say about that, don't they?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very prescient also to have Mr. Carby on the show today, because our topic today is time travel. And well, it's God's relationship to time, but the cultural trope, or the nerd trope, is time travel, and it helps. We're trying to use that to help explain God's relationship with time. And of course, one of the ways we would explain God's relationship with time is he is the creator of time. But then, does he, Paul, one of the questions we always consider is, does time matter to God, right? And
right, definitely.
Is it more of a construct to help us keep our head from exploding, right? When we're trying to figure things out, right? And what's going to happen is we're going to talk about some of those shows that address time travel. I mean, there's an endless number of them. Two of the main ones we're going to be focusing on today are the speaking of timeless, the British nerd fest that is Doctor Who.
Oh yes, Doctor Who.
That will which is approaching, at least in American terms, approaching retirement age. It's north of 60 now, and it began. And one of the things people don't know about Doctor Who, its first episode was the Sunday after. And I hate to be dark here, because we're not talking about death, but it was the Sunday after the assassination of President Kennedy, November, 27th, 1963. So really kind of odd, but that's odd timing, but that's how long it's been going. And so it is approaching its 60th anniversary. And so I mostly got into what they call the New Who, which is the reboot starting in 2009. With Christopher Eccleston, and then David Tennant and Matt Smith, and some great actors, and Peter Capaldi. But I probably watched it mostly through what I call the 10 through 11 incarnations, which are probably two of the more popular ones, certainly, which is David Tennant and Matt Smith. And from a time travel perspective, it's the show is ostensibly about this Time Lord, Doctor Who. And by the way, his name's not Doctor Who, he's just the doctor on the show. But he's a Time Lord who has a machine called the TARDIS, which is actually a blue British police box where you go into, and if you're concerned, you can, and this, I mean, I don't think they have them anymore, but in the past, you could, if you're in London and you're afraid that something's going wrong, going afoul, you could run and hide in there and call the police. And so he basically utilized that, the doctor, to create his little time travel machine.
And doesn't TARDIS stand for something? Doesn't it have like a
time and relative distance in space? That's right. So
Yeah.
it's not just time, it's spatial as well. It can travel through any point in time and any point in space if the coordinates are right. So yeah,
Right.
that's correct. That's correct. So yeah, thank you. Your geekdom scale just went up. So yeah, that's true. That's true. And so, but what's fascinating to think about is the doctor is a time lord and is therefore timeless in a sense and can be anywhere at once. And events that are 2,000 years in the past, and of course, since it's a time travel show, the doctor has been to the future and to the very bleak future, to the end of time. And so there's this scope. But what's interesting is they added a companion, a human companion, to the doctor who's finite, right? Who's like the rest of us, has an expiration date here on this world. And so sometimes the companions will talk to the doctor and say, well, how far out have you been? And say, well, I've been this far out, this many years, or I'm not sure, but it's thousands of years beyond this time scope, so I've been to the start of time, to the end of time. And so it's all kind of linear to me. And sometimes there'll be there's this depth to the show because British, right? And the companion will sometimes say, well, have you been, you've been beyond my lifespan. So have you been to my grave before? And sometimes the doctor will kind of sheepishly kind of so, we'll defer, but you can tell, yeah, he probably has visited, especially if it's one who's been with him for a while and is a favorite, someone he really likes. So there's that real depth, if you really think about it, even though it's supposed to be a kid's show of, okay, this Time Lord is traveling with someone who he not only knows is going to, expire long before his time is up, but also he's experienced life past this person's earthly existence. So that's we want to be careful because obviously it's a British show and there's some definitely a lot of non-Christian tones to it and perhaps even atheistic, but it kind of speaks a little bit to perhaps our understanding of God and time. What do you say, Paul?
There's a lot to get into there.
Yeah.
Definitely when you start calling someone a time lord, especially in relation to how we view God and time, it definitely presents some interesting discussions on that.
Yeah. Because a time lord in very nature would control time, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And this is what else is really weird in the show. The doctor comes from the time lords. He's not a singular time lord. There's a group of time lords. So
wow.
There's a planet of time lords called Gallifrey, and I need to go back and confirm that's definitely new Who canon. I believe it's old Who canon too, but yeah, it's this whole group of people who can do that and who basically have control over time and space, and probably even beyond. Like the doctor needs this machine to do it, but some of them don't necessarily. And I think he may have gotten in trouble, and that's why he is using the machine. But there are those who I think basically can just transcend it, like a god. So it's a godlike figure. But and just to clarify, it's not an eternal character. The doctor had to figure out a way to regenerate, and that's the writer's clever way of keeping the show going when the star of the show, the person portraying the doctor, is tired of being the doctor.
Yes.
And that's been because obviously it's been going for 60 years. They haven't had the same actor playing it. And in fact, the first doctor was probably north of 60 when he took the job. So they continue regenerating, which means that the doctor's contract runs out and they find a clever way to replace that person. And now with special effects, they've been able to make it look almost instantaneous. And so, a little CGI and makeup, there you go. So that's one, trope or example. And then a big one, I think this will be kind of the framing device for today is Back to the Future,
Oh,
right?
yes,
Paul, you want to
definitely.
kind of, for I think most people are familiar with this, even if they are, you know, uh, from a millennial or Gen Z generation. But
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
if you want to
Yep.
kind of talk, you want to talk about the show just in general, and then we can
Sure.
kind of jump into the analysis.
Absolutely. Yeah. So obviously, like you said, most people probably are familiar with this. I mean, it's Back to the Future. It's pretty perennial. Um, yeah. So the idea behind Back to the Future, of course, is Doc Brown builds this time machine. He has this idea of a device that somehow fuses time streams together so that he can uh, transverse them backwards and forwards. And ultimately, the problem, of course, arises. We know it's when there's a disturbance when Marty, Michael J. Fox's character, goes accidentally back in time and starts a chain of events that alter the timeline. And so as he comes back, we see in the subsequent sequels, as he comes back to the future, his timeline that he originally was on has been altered. And therefore, it gets into this whole, conundrum of how do we untangle this and put it back right. And so, what's interesting about Back to the Future, of course, Back to the Future, I think it was written by Robert Zemeckis and Bob Hale, I believe.
I think that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, came out in 1985. What's interesting, the subject of time travel is one of those things that has really been around for a while, like you said, with Who. And, as we talk with space time, as we've moved past that post-nuclear worldview into the Cold War, into the late 50s and 60s, we've had these ideas of, well, what can this do? Which is interesting because it's nuclear powered machines in Back to the Future. Of course,
right. Yeah.
Powered by plutonium.
Yeah.
But, this idea of what can the time stream do? Is it possible to go backwards and forwards? And what's interesting about Back to the Future is there are certain elements of the language, the vernacular that Doc Brown uses that actually has some credence in the discussions that we talk about. Like, for example, if you remember at one point where he and Marty are talking, I think they're in the high school, and Marty says something, I can't remember what it is, but Doc looks at him and says, Marty, you're just not thinking fourth dimensionally. Well, this is actually something that's commonly held, a belief, and we'll talk about this in just a second, the two views on time. But in one of the views on how time reacts, space and time together are bound in what's called a block or a static manifold, which is very similar to what Doctor Who plays with, that there's not just a time for every event, but there's a space for every event as well. And you can pinpoint in a three-dimensional or four-dimensional space a place in time and space. And so when he's saying fourth dimensionally, we think of the three dimensions for three-dimensional space, a length, a width, and a height. But then the fourth dimension, of course, being time. And so when Doc is telling him you're not thinking fourth dimensionally, he's referring to this idea of not thinking in terms of space-time. There's also different elements in there as well. When Doc tells him, did you interact with anybody? Did you come in contact with anybody? And he says, of course, Marty says, yeah, I bumped into my father. And that starts the whole thing with the pictures fading, right?
Yeah.
And this is another, common trope in the idea of time travel. If you go back to a previous moment in time and you muck up the timeline or undo something or just even move it by a microsecond, things unravel and they become all new. And it's moments like this when we start thinking about these things that our minds really start to bog down, because we see things in such a linear, unidirectional fashion.
Yes.
We start off at birth, we go to 1-year-old and 2-year-old and 10-year-old and graduation and marriage and all these things. And we're just kind of slowly marching forward, right? As Longfellow says, a funeral march to the grave. But this is only one view of how time and humanity, or really how time and reality interact. So a good way, I think, to start would probably be to start framing those two ideas, the common views of God and time.
Okay.
And so these were proposed initially by a guy named J.M. McTaggart in 1908. He wrote an article just titled Time. And in this article, he basically defined
Catchy title.
Yeah,
there, by the way.
Well, I guess, he didn't feel a need to elaborate. He just like straight to the point. But basically, he outlines that there are two interactions between time, an A and a B. Again, very catchy titles.
Yeah.
But the unique thing about A and B, or what is called A theory and B theory, is that they are diametrically opposed and unreconcilable. They are really at loggerheads with each other. And so the two were proposed in such a way that one cannot exist in such a way that the other one exists. The same statements cannot be true in both ways. And they really come down to a matter of true statements. A theory pertains to tensed statements and tensed facts. And by tensed, I mean as in past tense, future tense, present tense, as in I ate a hamburger for lunch, I will eat dinner later, I am drinking coffee, things like that. These
Gotcha.
are statements that have a temporal truth related to them. Now, what's interesting about these is that they are only true insofar as they relate directly to the action and in the tense it is. So I ate a hamburger yesterday is only true insofar as it is still today. Once it becomes tomorrow, that statement is no longer true. Just as much as I say, I will go to the store tomorrow, but once tomorrow gets here, that statement is no longer true. So there's truth values at stake here in an A theory of time. In this idea, every new moment coming into existence is a new moment in and of itself. It has a certain type of ontological priority. And by ontological priority, we just mean it has a sense of existence unto itself. It has a sense in which this moment exists right now insofar as no other moment exists, or it does not need any other moment to exist.
That's kind of the space theory you mentioned, like it has its own special place in the time continuum, as it were. Is that kind of another way to explain it?
So, yeah, like if you're looking at a timeline, and let's say you have the timeline of your birth up until this moment now, you could point to a moment on that timeline and say that that moment, if you were in that moment, existed. But
Okay.
According to an A theory, no moments before or after exist anymore. So therefore, as we're talking right now, in this whatever time it is right now, I don't know exactly what time it is, but 2:28. As we are talking here, 2:28 on April 22nd, the next moment, 2:29, hasn't happened yet. Therefore, It doesn't exist. And 2:27 has already gone. Therefore, it no longer exists. So it has this certain existence unto itself. And that's A theory. On B theory, you have this idea that all moments, all statements related to moments in time.
What, real quick, it's according to my clock, it's now 2:29. So that's last few conversations we have no longer exist. So just clarifying. So okay, go ahead.
But okay, so this is a good discussion. So on a B theory of time, we could say statements that are true irregardless of what time they were said. For example, we had that conversation prior to me saying this right now.
Right.
That's eternally true. That no amount of time past between us will ever change, that Paul and Robert had a conversation related to that prior to this moment. Just as much as the Kennedy assassination happened eternally before my birth in 1980, those two things will always be related in such a way. Those are tenseless relations. So in a B theory of time, those tenseless facts are always true. And they exist in what is deemed the space-time manifold, that at any given moment of experience, there is a point in which we can find that sometime or someplace in this block. And therefore, all times are real. They have this group ontological existence. They are real in and of themselves in the time in which they were in relation to each other. Under A theory, all moments are real in and so far as they relate to whatever the present is.
Okay.
So there is a difference on that regard.
Okay. So here's a quick way to frame it. The Back to the Future theory, which is if I go back to 1955, which was actually before I was born, let's say I go back into the 70s and tell my single digit self, invest in Apple, that I can, and maybe that's not the best example, but I can change the future. There's the Avengers Endgame version where you can't change it because that time has already happened. And now if you were to, like, you can't go back in the past because your present when you go back in the past is actually the past. So that sounds more like, so Avengers sounds more like A and Back to the Future like B. Am I getting that on point? Or
I think you're definitely on to something. And Back to the Future, you're definitely looking at more of a B theory of time.
Yeah, okay.
That there is, as well as with Doctor Who, there are times that are real, both forward and backward, upstream and downstream of where you are, that are real in and of the fact that you can visit them, you can go to them. In the Avengers, it's interesting you bring that up because they do something quite different. And the Avengers, they utilize time travel through a matter of space and speed of time. Speed of movement through time. If you remember, they go to I think it's the quantum level, and
quantum
they
realm, yeah,
and they move so fast.
Yep.
In that level that time hasn't caught up yet. This is related to something that we call time dilation, which is basically, if you remember in Back to the Future, where Doc sends Einstein 1 minute into the future and he shows the two clocks. They simultaneously roll, but one is 1 minute ahead of the other.
Now to clarify, just for those, if anyone hasn't seen the movie, that's not the Einstein, in case some people don't know who Einstein is. That's his dog, Einstein.
Yes, the dog Einstein.
He named his dog Einstein. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So puts the dog in the car, remote control, sends the car 1 minute into the future, and you see the clocks show two different times. This is a form of time dilation. And so in the Avengers, they seem to be playing with this idea that movement over a distance in a certain direction with a certain velocity will change the dilation of time between a distance of like one location A and where you want to go B. Now that's very different. And really, to be totally honest, that's pulling on some really kind of strange physics that frankly is a little above my pay grade. To be totally honest, if there is such a thing as time travel, it seems to me that it is, while a little bit, well, not a little bit, very far-fetched and completely outside of our technological realm, at least seemingly plausible on a B theory of time.
Right.
Based on the Avengers schema of time travel, it doesn't even seem plausible at all. And they've actually talked about this. I forgot the guy's name. I may have to look him up. I want to say it was someone Kip. but this idea that you could move through a wormhole where the gravitational force is so powerful that you could pull through this fabric of space. And as you sped up, you potentially would outrun the light stream and therefore see the past happening. This idea that you could cut through a wormhole and see yourself going in, even though technically you are ahead of that moment.
So in other words, you're just outrunning time.
Or outrunning light, or at least the perception of time.
Now, let me ask. Is it best to describe the A theory? And just to clarify, also, you note that the A theory is also called the dynamic theory. B is the static theory. Is one of these best described that if I were to build a time machine and attach a GPS and to run the GPS, there would really be nowhere to go because the only reality is present reality? Is that the best way to describe one of the, maybe A? Or
yes, I would think that's a good answer. Under A theory, yes, all that exists is the present, or at least some understanding of the present. Now, there are some people who would ascribe not to the block theory of time, but at least this idea that there is an understanding or existence of moments that have passed, but nothing of the future. So into this idea, there may be you can go back in time.
Yeah.
But then once you've gone backwards, you're present in that moment. So there is no moving forward.
So, and that would mean, okay, obviously, let's say here we are, April 22nd, 2022, and it's currently 2:36, and this is Central Standard Time for anyone who's wondering. And so we could go back to 2:20 or to whenever this episode started if we want, but are we stuck there then? Because we can't go forward because that's not reality yet. But can you go back to a reality that did exist? Does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. And under one school of thought, you definitely could. Now, in a B theory, again, this is all against, just thinking plausibly. On a B theory of time, the future is equally existent as the past. And so there isn't a way in which there is a future point and a future moment that someone could potentially find and go to. Right. But under an A theory of time, especially under an extreme version, which is called a presentist version, all that exists is the present. The past is no longer here. The future has not materialized yet. This is what we call temporal becoming and temporal regression. Moments have not become actual yet, and they are no longer existent. They have regressed into the past.
Okay.
And so all that exists is the present. So no, there is no past or future to go to. And there are several arguments, again, on both sides. One of, I think, the most interesting argument, if I can just elaborate on this for a second,
sure, is
this idea of backwards causation. And I want to bring this, I want to explain this, but I want to bring it back to the Future. Backwards causation is just this idea that you cannot affect things retroactively. And if you remember in Back to the Future, that's one of the biggest problems, is that Marty goes back to in the past and accidentally kicks off this chain of events that changes everything.
Right.
He's acting as an agent, what we call causal agent, something that has the ability to cause an effect. He's acting as this causal agent to alternate the time stream. But the challenge is, and this is what a lot of modern philosophers argue, is that there's really no such way to be causally active backwards. Everything happens going forward. If I drop my water, it spills. I'm the causal agent that causes the effect. But that would be like saying the water spills and therefore I cause the action to drop the water. That just doesn't seem to work in our understanding of physics or logic.
Ooh, that's deep stuff. So, okay. So what I'm thinking now is, Paul, I'm wondering if our listeners are where their brains are, if they're, because this is some great, I think you've done a great job of explaining it. It is heavy stuff though. So what I think would be a good idea is maybe if there's anything you want to kind of use to do to summarize this, or maybe kind of give us a little peek into God's relationship in all of this, but then maybe we could use the next episode to do a deeper dive on. I think we're going to devote one episode to the A theory and one to the B, in whatever order you want to do, and throwing in whatever nerd culture you want to throw in. But maybe you can kind of give us a little tease about God, just a real brief tease about God's role, which I know that sounds, give us just a brief tease on God's role in time, but maybe kind of set that up, and then we can take that into the next episode for everyone, and then kind of talk about where we're going to go from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So obviously the challenge becomes, as we experience moments in time, whether they are in a static series or a dynamic series, we have to ask the question, how does God do it as well? Is God in time, bound in time, as we would find a dynamic idea, or is God outside of time? Is God timeless in a static sense, or is God active in terms of feeling new moments as they come into and out of existence, in the same way we are? And so this definitely is a perennial problem. This has been one that has been around, gosh, as early as pretty much the incarnation, as far as probably before, but in the Christian sense, definitely since the early church. Augustine wrestled with this. Boethius definitely said a lot about this. And this, in the Boethian definition of time, that God was eternally present in a static sense, lasted well into the Middle Ages. In fact, John Duns Scotus is one of the first ones to really challenge it in a substantive way. And so the debate has gone back and forth. And the interesting thing is there are brothers and sisters in Christ who take up both sides of this argument. It is definitely not a foundational part of our belief system, but it is one that I do think has implications depending on how we view things. Certain things like God's foreknowledge, or the doctrine of foreknowledge, things about God's omniscience. When did he know what and to what degree? So there is some elements of this that are pretty important, especially to our faith, to wrestle with.
Okay, so that's pretty critical, because I think a lot of folks might be listening out there and thinking, this sounds really interesting, but how does it impact my faith and my spiritual walk? And I think you did a great job of summarizing that. So so why don't we do this? For those who are listening, want to just keep chopping on the bit moving forward, take a little break, get a little coffee or a drink or whatever your favorite snack is, and then load up for the next episode, which will be episode 3 of this series. And that's going to be, we're going to talk about we're going to do a deeper dive on the A theory. Is that correct? Is that what we're thinking, Paul? And then we do the next one's the B. And just kind of talk about, again, what the focus is going to be. A theory is the dynamic approach, and a deeper dive on God's relationship to that, or God's, our understanding of God's the nature of God, which involves also his relationship with time, for lack of a better term, right? And then the same thing with the B. And we're going to keep those aligned with some of our favorite movies and nerd culture shows, right? And there's
Absolutely.
there's a couple more I thought of, and we'll just see if we have to bring those in. Obviously, we've talked about the Twilight Zone and some of there's a lot of time travel examples there, but also the Terminator. And I don't even know where to begin with that one. I don't even know if we have time for that. I don't even know if the internet has enough bandwidth to do all that, talk about that one, and how crazy that one's gone. So anyway, again, we appreciate your listening, and just hop on over to the next episode and we do a deeper dive in this, but maybe decompress and listen to some simple music or what have you, and kind of take a break, because it's fascinating stuff. But we thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on the other side as we talk about the dynamic theory of God's relationship with time. Thank you.